Good day. Today is Saturday, 23rd November. As you can see, I'm back in my room in London. However, it is very late. I have arrived after a complex journey involving a flight from Budapest to London. And then, of course, there was the travel from the airport to my home in London, and then there were lots of other things that I needed to do. So I apologise for the fact that this video is coming out so late, and I apologise for its inevitable brevity. Nonetheless, I did say yesterday in my programme that I would make a video today, so I have decided to do so, even though it is done again in less than optimal conditions, and it will necessarily be rather short. I'm going to focus today on the situation in Ukraine. This is not because lots of important things are not taking place around the world. They absolutely are. There are more Israeli strikes, for example, on Beirut, and have been over the last few hours. But it is the situation in Ukraine that is critically important and becoming critically dangerous as the supporters of the Ukraine war become ever more feverish and desperate and reckless as they try to keep the war going in the 2 months left before Donald Trump takes office. And there is a kind of, I'm going to say it frankly, a kind of madness about the sense that we see now, the rush to try and do things somehow to tie down Donald Trump's hands in advance of his becoming president. Something which I have to say seems to me extraordinary and completely contrary to the ethos of the US constitutional system. But maybe that's the least important fact, given how dangerous all of this activity is. What I'm going to say is this: we are now undoubtedly heading, or strongly heading, towards a much more profound crisis. A crisis which I suspect many of these frightened, angry and desperate people who are making this decision do not fully understand. But I think in the end, their attempts are going to be unsuccessful. When Donald Trump does become president in 2 months' time, he will form a government. This time, a government which I predict, despite various problems, will be much more under his control than the government he headed in 2017. And I still think, overall, that his priority will be to try to stabilise the international situation and to prevent the deepening drift towards a world crisis. But in the meantime, we still have these 2 months to navigate. And we've had an article in the Financial Times which straightforwardly tells us what is going on. And it says that Biden aims to Trump-proof his legacy with policy blitz in final days. Outgoing president makes last push on Ukraine and seeks new judicial appointments and manufacturing subsidies. The judicial appointments we can ignore. Obviously, judges can be appointed, but getting them approved by the Senate might not be so straightforward in 2 months' time. And, well, realistically, Biden is not going to be able to change the entire balance of the US judiciary in the 4 weeks, the 8 weeks rather, that are left to him. Industrial subsidies and other things like that, well, of course, they can be reversed at any point in time. So again, I think we can disregard that. The reality is that when we read about President Biden wanting to secure his legacy, what that really means is that he's trying to support Ukraine to the greatest extent that he can, so as to box Trump, when he becomes president, into the position of having to continue his policies. And we read, this is from the Financial Times article, that in a flurry of last-minute decisions, Biden and his team have taken steps to help Kiev strengthen its position on the battlefield, ultimately improving its leverage in negotiations with Russia over a settlement that might now come sooner rather than later. To repeat again, and by the way, the British scholar Matthew Blackburn has a brilliant piece about this in National Interest. It is absolutely indispensable reading. All that is currently being done to support Ukraine is not going to strengthen Ukraine's position in negotiations with Russia. This is an absolutely ridiculous idea. On the contrary, as Matthew Blackburn absolutely correctly said, what all of these actions that the Biden administration is taking, what they're actually going to do is harden further the Russian stance, make the Russians even more determined to see this conflict through to its conclusion, and put in question the future survival of Ukraine. I'm going to come to that in a moment because there have been some important statements about this from the Russian Foreign Ministry over the course of the last few hours. But anyway, we then go on to read, and this is all taken from the Financial Times now. Trump, a skeptic of Ukraine aid, has pledged to end the war between Russia and Ukraine quickly, and Vice President-elect Vance also outlined a plan on the campaign trail in which Russia would hold on to the territory it has taken. But the Biden administration is still trying to give one last jolt to help to Ukraine, including a surge of $7 billion in lethal aid and significant policy shifts regarding the use of US-provided weapons. Notably, the United States has approved Kiev's use of long-range weapons for deep strikes into Russian territory and will transfer anti-personnel mines to Ukraine. And that indeed is what they have now been doing. Now, this push to try to support Ukraine, to keep the war going, to try to box in Donald Trump is, according to The Hill, a US magazine that covers policy, domestic and foreign policy and politics in the United States, it is supported by a group of people in Congress. We're not told who these people are. Probably we're talking about a small minority of people in Congress, or at least a small minority of people in the Republican Party. But apparently, or supposedly, there are moves to try to get Congress to approve over the next 8 weeks some kind of law that will oblige Donald Trump to continue to provide economic and military assistance to Ukraine, even if he doesn't want to. In other words, to tie his hands. We are told also by The Hill that there is no agreement yet, even amongst those who advocate this step, as to what form these amendments will take. Now, I'm going to say straight away that this proposed law, if it is ever passed, would be dubious constitutionally, as I understand it, seeking to tie the president's hands to prevent him from conducting the foreign policy of the United States as he thinks best, would, in my opinion, go against his constitutional prerogatives. But putting that aside, unless something very unexpected happens, I can't really imagine Congress approving this new law. I can't imagine that Speaker Johnson will agree to the House of Representatives voting on such a proposal. He's already made his stance on this clear, and I think that there would be such strong opposition amongst Republicans in Congress that I think that this idea is stillborn. Still, you never know, and one possibility must be that the plan is to try to provoke the Russians into some kind of extraordinary step which will allow or will enable some kind of crystallizing in Congress of support for this bill, whatever that bill turns out to be. An incredibly reckless, extraordinarily dangerous move, but one can understand the logic of it, because it needs to be said again that Congress last approved an appropriations bill for Ukraine back in April. Most of the money has now been spent. That's why we're talking about a further $7 billion in aid that the United States, the Biden administration, is hurriedly trying to put together. They're also looking for ways to provide Ukraine with some kind of loan finance so that it can continue to fund its war in some way, at least for a few more months. But the reality is, if things stand, just remain as they are, this appropriation is going to run its course. The loan sent to Ukraine is also going to run its course. The European powers have not been able to provide Ukraine with the funding it is seeking to continue the war, and they're in no position to provide the weapons either. And besides, without the Americans involved, there will be increasing doubts and skepticism amongst European lawmakers about whether it's even wise for the European states to continue to provide funding for Ukraine, given that without American funding, this is not going to assist Ukraine over the long term and is merely a case of throwing good money after bad. So unless there is a further appropriation by Congress in some form, either a direct decision to increase funding for Ukraine through some kind of a vote, or alternatively, a bill of the kind that is now being discussed is passed, then what we're going to see at some point over the next few weeks is a situation where there is no further funding for Ukraine because the funding provided by Congress has run out, and all that Donald Trump has to do is to leave that situation as is without taking any step to change it. Unless he comes to Congress and seeks an appropriation of aid for Ukraine of his own, which would be completely contrary to all of his previous statements, then sometime in January, the funding for Ukraine will cease without Donald Trump himself having to do anything. This is something that I think that in all of the massive discussions that have taken place over the last few weeks, ever since Donald Trump's election, and by the way, even before, very few people seem to have grasped. That is why we're seeing these moves in Congress. And as I said, unless something very unexpected happens, I suspect that those attempts are going to fail. Playing these kind of tricks worked in 2017 when there was a lot of skepticism in Congress about whether Trump was a properly elected president. There were many people in Congress who at that time did generally believe that there might be something in the allegations that he had been involved with the Russians in some way in getting himself elected. And besides, he had not won the popular vote in that election. This time, in 2024, he has both parties, he has both houses of Congress with strong number under Republican control, with the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, largely supportive of him. And yes, he does still face some opposition from some Republicans in the Senate, but their position has significantly weakened over the last 8 years, even if they have been successful over the last few days in preventing Trump's nominee, Gatz, from being confirmed as Attorney General. So I don't think this is going to work this time. These kind of games were successful in 2017. They're not going to be successful this time. Anyway, that's the Financial Times. It is telling us that Biden is pulling every stop. When I say Biden, of course, I mean Biden and the team around him. What level of decision making Biden himself is involved in, no one can guess fully anymore. Though I'm going to say this, I think that he does have very strong visceral feelings of hostility to Vladimir Putin, very strong visceral feelings supporting Ukraine, in which he was deeply involved, and certainly I don't think he is in any way averse to the pattern of decision making that we have seen over the last week. So anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the United States. In France, it is the same. The French foreign minister has incredibly come along and made very similar comments. Monsieur Baron, as I understand his name is, he's come forward. Monsieur Barrot, Jean-Noël Barrot, has come forward and said that Ukraine can launch missile strikes on Russian territory for self-defense purposes, and that France does not impose any red lines on the use by Ukraine of French missiles. Of course, he's referring to the Scalp missiles, and in an interview with the BBC, he did not even rule out sending French troops to the combat zone. In other words, he's trying again on behalf of his master, Emmanuel Macron, to revive the Macron proposal of a few months back of sending French troops to fight in Ukraine. A proposal which was deeply unpopular with the French people, and by the way, the French military, and across Europe generally, when it was made. So the French still pressing forward with this pattern of escalation that we have seen over the last week, and that has now provoked some comments from the Russians. And in particular, it has provoked comments from the Russian Foreign Ministry, specifically from Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, who has said that the actions that the Europeans are taking, specifically the actions that the French are taking, well, that all that is going to achieve is that it is going to call into question the whole existence of Ukraine. Well, that seems to contradict the theory set out in the Financial Times, which says that all of these moves made by Joe Biden are intended to strengthen Ukraine's position in advance of negotiations. I have absolutely no doubt that Zakharova is speaking for the Russian government, including the Kremlin. The position that she is taking is consistent with that stance, with the stance of the full Russian government. And I think that any idea that launching missiles into Russia is going to cause the Russians to soften their stance is a complete misreading of the situation. Incidentally, I noticed that the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, now has come forward and said that the conflict in Ukraine ceased to be a regional war long ago, that Russia has entirely switched to a war economy and is manufacturing as many weapons and munitions in 3 months as the European Union can manufacture in a year. Our defense is a fragile thing. And he says that Germany should invest in more warfare capabilities. Though, as many people pointed out to me whilst I was in Hungary, and I want to stress these were government people, people who are close to the government, people who, by the way, work in the defense sector. The reality is that building up war capabilities in Europe is not something that can be done in a day or a week or a month or a year. It is a long-term project that could take, at best, a decade to bear fruit in the way that Boris Pistorius presumably wants. And on that topic, none other than General Zaluzhny, the former Ukrainian commander-in-chief, military commander, he's actually made some comments about this, about the inability of the Europeans to stand up to the Russians in any kind of long drawn-out conflict. And I quote him, he said that the number, these are Zaluzhny's words, the number of aerial targets is growing while the number of air defense systems is limited and they are very expensive. Even in these terms, I don't think that either Britain, Zaluzhny is the ambassador to Britain, or other European countries will be ready. Although there are enough F-16s with excellent air defense capabilities, the air defense system can be completely emptied in 2 or 3 months. European countries lack munitions to shoot down air bombs. Does any European country or the United Kingdom have at least 5,000 projectiles for the Patriot systems to intercept guided aerial bombs? I doubt that, because they're very expensive, and hence there cannot be a lot of them, since it is quite problematic to manufacture them. So it can probably be said that European countries are not ready. And that was said by Zaluzhny in an interview to the Ukrainian media outlet Ukrainskaya Pravda. In other words, all this brave talk from people like Monsieur Barrot, from the British, from all of the others about taking on, from Pistorius, about taking on the Russians, is a fantasy in military terms. It is unachievable. The Russian military is far more powerful, and the difference in military power is increasing by the day, and there is nothing in the short term that can be done to change that. On the contrary, with the Russians producing 4 times more weapons every year than, according to Pistorius, the European Union does, the gap between Russia and the Europeans is increasing. And the gap, by the way, between the Russians and the Americans is almost certainly increasing as well. Anyway, so much for the Western powers. Feverish activity, desperate measures, giving the Ukrainians everything that's left to try to keep the war going. No clear objective, none announced. Talk about negotiations, putting Ukraine in a stronger negotiating position with the Russians, when, as I said, the reality is that it will achieve the diametric opposite, make the Russians even more intransigent, as the Russian Foreign Ministry has said. But what about the Russians? Well, over the last 24 hours, Putin has called together a meeting of, as his website says, as the Kremlin website said, the Defense Ministry leadership, representatives of Russia's military industrial complex, and missile system developers. And Putin provided a little more information about the nature of the Oreshnik system. And the thing that struck me immediately on reading this rather long summary of his comments that the Kremlin website has provided, obviously all very carefully pre-prepared, is that it is clear that the Oreshnik is intended to be a conventional weapon, a non-nuclear weapon. The Oreshnik missile system is not just an effective hypersonic weapon due to its striking power, especially when used en masse. Notice that it's supposed to be used in numbers, several missiles conducting a strike simultaneously, and in combination with other long-range precision systems that Russia also has. Using it against enemy targets will be comparable in effect and power to using strategic weapons. Although, in fact, the Oreshnik system is not a strategic weapon, in any case, it is not an intercontinental ballistic missile, and it is not a means of mass destruction, also because it is a high precision weapon. And he then went on to say there are no means of countering such a missile, no means of intercepting it exist in the world today. And I will emphasize once again, we will continue to test the latest system. And then he mentioned over the course of this meeting that the Russians have a stockpile of these missiles. This was not a solitary test of this particular missile, but that it will now be entering serial production, that it's been perfected and it's ready for operation. Apparently, decisions were made in the summer of last year to move forward with completion of its development, and that has now been achieved. And then there was all sorts of comments from all kinds of senior Russian officials. Vasily Tonkoshkurov, the first deputy chair of the Military Industrial Commission, the Director General of Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, Yuri Borisov, who is, by the way, an army general, the commander of the Strategic Missile Forces, Sergei Karakayev. They are the people who will be operating this system. Anyway, they've all said that the system is ready for production, serious production and deployment, and we are likely to see more of them being produced over the next few months. The key takeaway, however, to repeat once more, is that this is a non-nuclear system. Yesterday, in my program, I spoke about the Oreshnik having the ability to operate with alternative warheads, either nuclear or conventional. Putin, in these comments, is leading us to think that it is intended for use only with conventional warheads. Now, that is a dramatic new capability. Long range, intercontinental ballistic missiles have been created before. Medium range nuclear missiles have been created before, but it has always been understood that they will operate with nuclear warheads. This is the first system of this kind, possessing this kind of capability to move at speeds of Mach 10 to 12 and to launch warheads at extremely high max speeds, many times the speed of sound, which is intended to operate as a purely conventional system. Now, I've had a very interesting email from a source who has provided me with believable, I think entirely plausible information about the Oreshnik. He says, first of all, that the system has been created based upon technologies used in the development of various types of intercontinental ballistic missiles. He's clearly referring to the Topol Yars family of road mobile systems that the Russians have been working upon basically since the 1980s and which are now in series production and deployed on a significant scale. And he says that these systems operate somewhat like Lego. You can, and were always designed to be used in that way. These are modular, that you can put various stages of these missiles together. You can integrate them in all sorts of ways and operate them in all kinds of ways so that you can build missiles using essentially similar technologies, some of which will have intercontinental ranges and will be equipped with nuclear warheads, sometimes, by the way, hypersonic glide vehicle nuclear warheads, but alternatively shorter-ranged missiles like the Oreshnik, which will have conventional warheads for use in conventional battles. And this source also speculated, and here the source accepts that he is engaging in speculations, that the warheads are in fact filled with explosives, but specifically a very modern, newly developed type of explosive, first developed in Germany, but it's likely that the Russians have copied, or if not copied, have developed an analogous technology. And from what I can understand, that these warheads, this explosive, has a metallic base. I'm not going to pretend I understand this in any great detail, but there is an explosive charge. But as I said, it uses a new kind of explosive of a sort that we have not seen used before in weapons of this kind. I'm going to go further, and I'm going to make a guess, and I suspect it's a correct guess on this occasion, that the Oreshnik is in fact the Rubezh. The Rubezh was an intermediate nuclear missile that was being started development by the Russians in the late 2000s. It was tested for the first time in 2011. I suspect that when the Rubezh operates, rather when the missile operates with a nuclear warhead, it becomes the Rubezh. When it operates with this new, highly advanced, conventional warhead, it becomes the Oreshnik. It is, if I'm right about that, then the implications of this are nightmarish. It will make it almost impossible, all but impossible, for the United States trying to keep track of the deployment of these missiles to decide whether they're actually nuclear missiles or not. Putin, of course, has just signed off a decree lowering the nuclear thresholds. I'm going to suggest that on top of the proposals from people like Professor Sergei Karaganov to lower the nuclear thresholds, and again, separately from the current crisis, the one we are seeing as a result of the Ukrainian war, the lowering of the nuclear thresholds is connected with Russia now acquiring this new terrifying capability, the one provided by the Oreshnik, which enables the Russians to conduct deep missile strikes anywhere over vast territories, including the whole of Europe, using a technology that no one up to this point has been able to counter. It puts the Russians in a position to, an overwhelmingly strong position, to conduct a regional war, whilst through lowering the threshold, making it clear that any country that seeks to counter this Russian capability risks facing a nuclear attack. So anyway, there we are. That is what I think the Oreshnik is. I understand that Professor Theodore Postol has been doing a whole series of interviews in which he has discussed the nature of this weapon. I have not yet seen these interviews. I absolutely do intend to do so. He is a rocket scientist after all, which, by the way, I obviously am not. So his views on the Oreshnik should be considered authoritative. And I'll be very interested to hear what he has to say. I've heard from third parties that he too confirms that this is a capability that he has never seen before, and which is an extremely frightening one. Anyway, there we are. That is what is happening with the development of the Oreshnik missile. It is astonishing that there is still continues to be a determination, or at least I'm not even sure that determination is the right word, a kind of feverish anger, a denial of reality, a obsessive desire, a kind of madness to continue this pattern of escalation, even as the Russians trundle out a weapon with the capabilities that the Oreshnik unquestionably has. I say unquestionably has because I noticed that Zelensky's advisor, Mikhailo Podolyak, is now denying that it even exists, even despite the fact that Zelensky himself acknowledged its existence. And, well, we have all seen the film, the really incredible and dramatic film, setting out what happened. Well, on all of this, on all of these dramatic events, there are now reports that Donald Trump is now considering appointing Rick Grenell, his envoy, to try to settle the disputes between Russia and Ukraine, to try to persuade the Ukrainians and the Russians to sit down and continue negotiations. We'll see. Other reports previously suggested that it would be one of Trump's lawyers. As I said, we'll see. But meantime, even as the Biden administration and some European governments continue to provoke the Russian bear, taking on astonishing, incredible risks, the Russians continue winning the war. Now, I was reading reports over the course of today, and I want to stress these are reports which I've only been able to follow in the sketchiest detail. But I've been reading reports that the Ukrainians are now have now made basically the decision to retreat from Kurakovo. It seems that Kurakovo is, the Ukrainians understand that Kurakovo is undefendable, and that they're taking the first steps to try and withdraw as best they can from this all but surrounded town. It seems that if they do retreat, they are likely to suffer extremely heavy losses, just as they suffered extremely heavy losses when they retreated a few weeks ago from Ugledar. And there are also reports that the Russians have now reached the very outskirts of the small fortified town of Velikaya Novosilka. This is to the south of Kurachovo and to the west of Ugledar. The Velikaya Novosilka is virtually surrounded, and that the loss of this town by Ukraine is perhaps only days away. The Russians are also now saying that they control a third of Chasiv Yar. Again, I haven't seen this confirmation of this, but that they're now fighting in the central areas of Chasiv Yar to take control of the factory district, and that they have established that they have gained access to Chasiv Yar itself. And I was reading today, this is from the Russian news agency TASS, that the Ukrainians are now admitting that they have lost, at the very least, 40% of the territory in Kursk region that they previously controlled. This is the TASS report. Ukraine has lost control over more than 40% of territories in Russia's borderland Kursk region. It seized in an August attack, Reuters said, citing a source in the Ukrainian General Staff. At most, we controlled 1,376 square kilometers. Now, of course, this territory is smaller. Now we control approximately 800 square kilometers. I think this is an overstatement, by the way. Again, I'm not fully up to date with the level of the fighting, but I think the realities are almost the exact opposite. I think that the Ukrainian pocket in Kursk region is not 60% of its original size or its maximum size. I think it is closer to 40% of its maximum size. And in the meantime, Ukraine continues to suffer appalling losses right across the battlefields, with no sign that that is slackening in any significant way. Putin is talking about increasing production or putting the Oreshnik into serial production. He has again warned that the Russians are prepared to use the Oreshnik to attack positions in Europe. Zaluzhny tells us that there is no defense, even from other types of Russian attack on Western Europe. There isn't an air defense capability across Europe to parry Russian attacks. Pistorius tells us that the Russians are producing 4 times more military equipment a year than the entire European Union is able to do. The Russians are advancing every day, and still some people talk about escalation. They talk about sending European troops to fight the Russians. They ignore the dangers that systems like the Oreshnik pose. They continue to be prisoners of their own obsession and their own desperation, losing sight completely of the realities. I have to say that I have never seen anything quite like this at any point in my lifetime, and I struggle to think of any time in modern history where we have seen behavior of this kind. When people decide to escalate a war, when governments in the past have sought to escalate a war, or indeed start a war, they have generally done it in the expectation that they're going to win, not realizing that if they do escalate, they stand an overwhelming chance that they are going to lose. It makes it even more bizarre when they propose to take steps which could put in jeopardy not only Europe, perhaps Russia, certainly the United States, but the whole of humanity and civilization as we know it. Anger, fear, fanaticism, hatred seem to be completely in control. Reason has been thrown away. We are going to have a very difficult 2 months ahead of us, something that many people in Budapest said in my presence. We just have to hope that even as we're throwing all reason and sense, and indeed humanity, out of the window, the Russians are not in the grip of the same hysteria as we are. Well, on that rather ominous note, I finished today's program. I will be returning to more orderly programs, or so I hope, tomorrow. Let me repeat again briefly that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.